Welcome, everyone. This is the fifth out of six classes of this year we are slaves, next year we will be free with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you so much, Evie. Welcome back, everyone, for the fifth of what will be six classes on this year we are slaves, next year we will be free. We're getting towards the end, which means we're getting closer to getting out of Egypt and hopefully to start thinking about not just what does it mean to leave Egypt, but as we'll see today, what does it mean to make sure that you don't find your way back in Egypt again? One of the great challenges of the Exodus narrative, and this is part of the reason I find it so compelling, is that it's not just about how you physically liberate yourself, emancipate yourself from the chains that enslave you. But there's this profound recognition in the Torah that even when you leave slavery, there's another level of emancipation, of liberation that has to take place to ensure that you don't find yourself back there again. And I think one of the things that makes the Torah so important is that it's not only cognizant of this fact, but it is actually trying to lay out a path for what does it mean to ensure that, again, the Jews don't find their way back in Egypt once again. Today, we're going to look at exactly that point, the way in which there's actually technically a halachic prohibition not to go back to Egypt, but we're going to look at what that means on a much more symbolic level, though also not even so symbolically, about how the Torah, the rabbis understood the dangers of trying to return to Egypt. Yeah, and I'll even say it most straightforwardly, the danger of returning to Egypt is not just going to the physical location of Egypt, right? The ultimate danger of returning to Egypt, as we'll see, is the danger of turning Jewish life in the land of Israel into Egypt. That is something that is it's not even just a subtext of the Tanakh itself. It's actually, one might say it right on the surface. With that, let me just open up the slides. This year we're slaves, next year we'll be free. You can't go back to Egypt. So if you remember, in our very first session, we looked at Pharaoh's racist fantasy that ultimately leads to the enslavement of the Jews, right? The Jews is this obstacle to all the hopes and dreams that Pharaoh has for Egypt. And therefore, they, as the obstacle, have to be subjugated in order for Egypt to be able to be what it wants to be. In the second session, we looked at Moshe as this figure who attempts the impossibility of justice, fighting against the system and ultimately losing, but it is ultimately because of his willingness to fight that he is seemingly chosen by God to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. We looked at Pharaoh's intransigence, his unwillingness to hear Moshe's message, his unwillingness to recognize God's miracles, and ultimately his unwillingness to even acknowledge that there can be something beyond Pharaoh and Egypt, right? That is the world from which Pharaoh views everything. And to a certain extent, God is a break in that, a rupture in that. And again, any system, when it confronts a contradiction or a rupture, it does all that it can to either deny it, repress it, contain it, or explain it away, which is exactly what we see Pharaoh do. Last week, we switched back to the perspective of the Jewish people. And we were looking in the narrative for where is it that the Jews themselves fight for their freedom? Where is it that they take action, that they find their agency, that they can take responsibility? And I argued that we see that in the Korban Pesach, right? The slaughtering of the Paschal Lamb, which is itself a symbol of the Egyptian gods. And as we spoke about last week, that act is very much a radical act, because by slaughtering the Korban Pesach, they are risking the anger and the violence of the Egyptians, who may very well try to kill the Jews as a result of this. And perhaps even more importantly, by slaughtering the Korban Pesach, the Jews are not just killing the Egyptian gods, they're killing their own gods, because the Jews have been slaves in Egypt. They know nothing more beyond Egypt either. This week, we're going to see the moments in which the Jewish people finally seem to be beyond Egypt. So they have more or less physically left the geographical boundaries of Egypt, but at the very moment when they're essentially able to finally leave Egypt behind, right, Egypt seems to come right back and want to take them down to Mitzrayim again. And not only that, the Jews themselves maybe seem to think perhaps it's better to go back to Egypt than whatever God ultimately has planned for us. So to frame what we're going to be looking at today, again, this problem of going back to Egypt, the temptation of going back to Egypt, the dangers that presents, I want to look at the verses that appear right before the splitting of the Red Sea. Right before the splitting of the Red Sea, if you remember, the Jews have left Egypt. They more or less think they're clear, right? Like, okay, we're good. We're finally out. We're free. Now we can, move forward and fulfill God's mission for us, God's vision of returning to the promised land. But of course, the Jews don't actually go in the most direct way to Israel. If you're familiar with the geography in this region, right, the direct way to go to Israel from Egypt would be to follow basically the Mediterranean, right, to go up the Sinai Peninsula along the coast, right? That's not what Moshe does. Because again, Moshe, God recognized the Jewish people are not necessarily ready to go straight to Israel. Instead, they go east, right? They go further into the desert, and they find themselves at the Red Sea. And the problem, of course, is that Paro has not let them go, right? Paro's heart becomes hardened, right? Paro gathers up his chariots, his soldiers, and pursues the Jews. And before they know it, the Jews suddenly find themselves between the proverbial rock and a hard place, right? The Red Sea is in front of them. They have nowhere else to go. And behind them is Paro and his army, guaranteeing either certain death or a return to slavery. And this is a profoundly difficult moment for the Jews because it seems that everything they've gone through, all the efforts, all the sacrifices, all the miracles, it almost appears to them as if it's all for naught. Here's how the Torah frames the moment, right? It says, the Egyptians gave chase to the Jews. All the chariot horses of Paro, his horsemen, and his warriors overtook them and camped by the sea, right? I guess basically corners the Jewish people at Yam Suf. As Pharaoh grew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Was it for a lack of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness?" Right, this is the classic Jewish humor, sarcasm, right? In the moment of crisis, we make a joke. But in this case, it's not like a joke at their own expense, right? It's a joke at Moshe's expense, right? This joke reflects a profoundly cynical perspective because it basically says, like, all the dog and pony show, all the fireworks, all the miracles, it was for nothing, Moshe, right? They're basically showing they have no faith at all. They say to him, "What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt?" With the implication being it was all a waste. And ultimately, as it says here, is not this the very thing we told you in Egypt, saying, "Let us be, and we will serve the Egyptians, for it is better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Now, what's interesting is we didn't actually hear that dialogue in Egypt, but here the Jewish people are saying to Moshe, "We've already told you this was going to be a failure. You came, you wanted to liberate us. We told you that wasn't going to happen, wasn't going to work. It simply wasn't possible." Right? So what the Jews are reflecting on, essentially, or they're acknowledging, is their own resistance to liberation. Even when they were in Egypt, where they said to Moshe, "We'd rather be slaves because the alternative is just going to mean death." At that very moment, Moshe turns to the people and he says, "Have no fear. Stand by and witness the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For the Egyptians who you see today, you will never see again." He's telling the Jews, this is the last day you're ever going to see Paro. After this, you will never see him again. Now, this line here, the Jews will never see Egypt, will never see Paro again, right? In the context of the story, it makes sense, right? This is Moshe telling them, you guys got to, have a little bit of courage, right? You got to buckle your belts. Like, you got to realize this is the moment of truth, right? This is the moment where everything changes. That's Moshe's context for this line. But the rabbis actually note that Moshe's warning to the people that they're never going to see Egypt again, they're never going to see Paro again, actually serves as a source for the biblical prohibition. It's one of the 613 commandments that a Jew must not go back to Egypt. Right now, what's interesting is in the context of the story, it's very clear that the Moshe's warning to them, again, yes, it's about you're not physically going back to Egypt, but what it really reflects, again, is the psychic enslavement that the Jewish people feel. Right, he's basically trying to tell them, you're free. Right, you're free. Start acting like free people. Now is the time. Right, so the concern, at least the subtext, is that the return to Egypt, right, is a return to slavery. And that there's a temptation or desire to want to go back to that, presumably because it's easier, because the alternative means dangers, challenges, perhaps even death. All right. And the obligation is on us to overcome that fear, that desire that drives us back to slavery. That's what Moshe is ultimately telling the people. And of course, if we read the verses continuing, we would see the miracle happens, the sea splits, the Jewish people begin to cross, and ultimately Paro and his army goes in as well, but they perish as the waters of the Red Sea come back and fall upon them. Now, as I keep saying, the return to Egypt is as much a sort of psychological and political problem as it is a physical, geographical location problem. And part of the reason we know that is that even if there's a biblical prohibition not to go back to Egypt, what was there at least for most of the last 2,000 years in Egypt, right? There's a very large, prominent Jewish community, right? Not only was there a large, prominent Jewish community in Egypt, probably the greatest rabbi of the last 2,000 years, Moses Maimonides, right? The Rambam, right? He was the head rabbi of Egypt, right? And not only was Rambam the head rabbi of Egypt, he chose to go to Egypt. He actually, does anybody know where Rambam was before he was in Egypt? You're not going to believe this, right? Where was the Rambam before he was in Egypt? He was in Eretz Yisrael, right? The Rambam ultimately leaves Spain to Morocco as a fairly young youth. In Morocco, he's living under the Almohads, this sort of fundamentalist Islam that is forcing Jews to convert. He ends up leaving Morocco. He ends up going to Eretz Yisrael. There's not a lot of Jews in Israel. It's not an easy place to be. He ends up going to Egypt, to Cairo, and becomes the head of the Jewish community there. So the Rambam doesn't just live in Egypt, he chooses to go to Egypt from Israel, you might say, right? So we're still left with this question, how can it be a biblical prohibition to be there, right? That's seemingly, how could the Rambam of all people be the one then to violate it, right? He literally writes a listing of all the mitzvot, right? So as he's writing the prohibition not to go back to Egypt, as he lives in Egypt, like, how does he make sense of this? Right, so I brought a couple of sources here. Maybe I'll just summarize them briefly. The Ritba is a medieval Jewish authority, rabbinic authority. He recognizes the problem. What do you mean you can't go back to Egypt? Jews seemingly have been continually going back to Egypt. And what the Ritba suggests is a variety of possibilities. He says, Kvar Pirshu Besifre Lagorsha, right? He's noting that at least in some of the midrashim, the real problem of going back to Egypt is not going back for a visit. It's not going back to do business there, right? It's going back to live there, right? In a more permanent sense. Okay. I guess that makes sense, right? You can go back, but just temporarily, don't put down roots there. But we still have a problem with the Rambam, of course, and many other Jews who didn't just visit, they actually live there in an ongoing fashion, right? As he says, Omiha timiha milta amal samchua olam lagor. Right. Again, if we're going to say you can go back temporarily, visit for business, then what about the Jews who lived there? What were they relying on? Lagor b'zman hazev Mitzrayim kigona Rambam. V'kama gedolim acherim. It wasn't just the Rambam. There were plenty of other great rabbis who lived in Egypt. V'yesh omrim. So what's the possibility? She'otan hayarot kvar nitzbalbalu v'nichravu. He says, this is, I think, actually very important. The Egypt of our ancestors, right? The Egypt of the Torah is not the Egypt of the time of the Rambam. Right, the cities of ancient Egypt, of the Egyptians as we traditionally think about them, have already been destroyed. The peoples of ancient Egypt have already been mixed up all over. Right, you're probably aware that the ethnic group that lives in North Africa, right, is Arab. Right, they come from the Arabian Peninsula, at least in Egypt. Right, they're not direct descendants, I think, my understanding, of the ancient Egyptians. From like the time of the Torah. There was an awareness of this already at that time, right? That whoever is in Egypt, it's not the same Egyptians that the Torah was concerned about. It's not the same people, not even necessarily the same culture. Right? These are like different cities. That's what the Ritba says. That were settled by others who came later, right? So again, the Egypt of today is not the old Egypt, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. You could live there if you need to. Rav Eliezer Memitz, another medieval rabbi, Tereit Shelo Asara Katuv Ela Laholech B'Derech Hachu Shemei Eretz Yisrael. Right, the real problem going to Egypt is if you go from Israel directly. Right, that's the real issue. The issue is not Egypt per se; it's to be in Israel and then to go to Egypt. And this is already getting at that idea that I mentioned to you before the beginning. Right, the real problem of this prohibition is this sense of like almost turning Israel into Egypt. But here they're expressing it as you can go to Egypt from America, you can go to Egypt from Europe, you can't go to Egypt from Eretz Yisrael. Midbar leBitzrayim. Tahachi Ketziv, V'kra lo Tzifun l'shuv b'derech hazeh. All right, because again, you're never supposed to go back that way again. V'nachon yoter she'ein Yisrael hu ela b'zman she'Yisrael shuyim al admatam. right? That the real prohibition of going back to Egypt is when the Jewish people as a collective are living in the land of Israel. But now when the Jewish people are in dispersion, right, therefore Egypt has no special significance. Egypt only has a real significance when the Jews can live as a collective in some real sense in the land of Israel. So already in the Ritba, we see sort of hinting to this, right? The real problem of Egypt was ancient Egypt. The real problem of Egypt is to go from Israel to Egypt. The real problem of Egypt is when there's a Jewish society in the land of Israel, right? And again, so what's the issue here, though? What's the real problem? Sefer Chinuch, who I also brought here, another medieval rabbi, he basically says the problem of being in Egypt is that you're going to learn from Egypt. You're going to learn the evil, wicked ways of Egypt. It's going to have an influence on you. That's why you cannot be there. It's sort of like Avraham and Lot, right? Avraham and Lot both come to the land of Israel together. They end up separating at a certain place. At a certain point, Lot ends up in Sodom, right? And what we realize as we read the story of Lot and Sodom is that even if Lot is a righteous man, right, Sodom seemingly still has an influence on him, right? When the angels come and he decides to host them, and the people of Sodom surround his house and demand the angelic visitors be taken out so they can do their whatever they're going to do to them, right? What does Lot offer? He says, well, you can have my daughters, right? Lot's time in Sodom has not necessarily done well for him, right? And the concern very much for the Jews is that being in Egypt, right, being in ancient Egypt is not going to do well for them either. But we really have to, again, continue to unpack what's going on here. What's the danger of Egypt? What's the danger of going back to Egypt, right? What's really at stake? So to begin to get a sense of this, we actually have to look at a set of verses that appear in Deuteronomy and Devarim, a set of verses that relate to the obligation or the laws of a Jewish king. Now, if you know anything about the Torah's approach to a king, you might know that there's a little bit of ambivalence, right? And we're gonna push on that ambivalence quite a bit in just a moment, right? Even though the Torah here in Devarim says the Jewish people should appoint a king, it doesn't seem that God is in love with the idea of kings, of Jewish kings, right? As we'll see, perhaps because how do we typically refer to God, right? God is Melech Machem Lachim, right? God is supposed to be the ultimate king, right? So if you have a Jewish king, right, you run the risk of the Jewish king getting in the way of our relationship with God, who is supposed to be, the one true king for the Jewish people. And as we know from the Jewish people's experience in Egypt, right, once you have a king, and what's important is that Paro is referred to as Melech Mitzrayim. He is very much a king, right? One of the things that we know from Egypt is that if you have a king and that king has a lot of power, what do you risk ultimately happening, right? You run the risk of that king using their power in an abusive and oppressive manner, right? That is the danger of kings. It is particularly the danger of kings when you look at Tanakh, right? If you keep reading Tanakh, right, you see king after king after king, like 3/4 of them are awful, evil people who do awful, evil things. And even the best of them, right? David uses his power in an abusive way to take what he wants at the expense of others, right? He does tshuva for it, but even he sins in that fashion, right? So kings are to a certain extent like playing with fire, and the Torah knows this. And that's why in Devarim, when it raises the idea of a king, it is very, very careful to limit the power of the king, right? It places all these limits, and this is a bit, again, unusual in the context of the ancient Near East. It's not that all kings were all powerful in the ancient Near East, but the Torah goes out of its way to emphasize the king's subordinate status, right? That the king is responsible to God, right? The king is responsible to the law, just as all the Jews are. The king is not above the law. The king is not God, right? That's going to become very, very clear for us. So the Torah says here, it says, if after you've entered all the land, this is Moshe speaking to the people, that your God has assigned to you and taken possession of and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. Right? So what's strange about these verses, it's not God, Moshe saying to the Jewish people, when you get to Israel, you must appoint a king. That's not exactly the language here. It's a little bit conditional. It's when you get to Israel and you say that you want to be like all the other nations and have a king. Right? That there's something about a king that's a bit more on the Jewish people than it is about God. Because as I mentioned, as we'll see in Sefer Shmuel, God doesn't really like a king, but the people really do. And part of the reason that people really want to have a king is that you can't be a nation in the ancient Near East if you don't have a king. At least that's what the Jews think. right? So when they say they want a king, it's basically their way of saying, we want to be like just all the other nations. But God goes on, or Moshe goes on to lay out, again, the limitations on a king's power. You shall be free to set a king over you, one chosen by your God, right? First and foremost, the people don't necessarily decide the king alone, right? God has a role to play in that. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner, meaning you can't have somebody who's not Jewish become the king, one who is not of your kin. So it's got to be a Jew, and God's going to be involved in the decision. Now we get to the limitations. You shall, moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since God has warned you, you must not go back that way again. Now, it's very interesting here is that one of the primary limits on a king's power is it can't have too many horses. Why? Because to get those horses, the verse seems to imply you're going to have to go back to Egypt. And God has told you, or Moshe has told the Jewish people, they're not going back to Egypt ever again. That there's something we see already connecting here between the idea of a king's power, and the concern of going back to Egypt. We're going to keep unpacking that. But this is the only other reference in the Chumash to this idea that you can't go back to Egypt. It's the verse we saw before in the Exodus, right when they're at the Red Sea, and it's this one right here. Those are the only two references, right? So when we look at it and see it here in the context of the king, right, that's a sign that there must be a connection between them. The verses continue. Moshe says, and he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. Can't have too many horses, not too much military power. I'm already giving it away, but can't have too many women, too many wives, and he can't have too much wealth. Now, what we see being laid out here are basically three of the primary dimensions of a king's power, right? The horses, or excuse me, represent military power. The wives primarily represent, or is seen as representing, right, the power of a king, a Jewish king, to build alliances and diplomatic relationships, right? Because the way that you build treaties between countries, particularly in the ancient Near East, is that one country sends its princess, one king sends his daughter to go marry another king, and that ties them together. And we actually see this in Sefer Malachim, that Shlomo, King David's son, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, actually marries Pharaoh's daughter, right? Because again, it's part of the building alliance between Israel and Egypt at that time, right? So again, if he can't have too many wives, though, he can't just build alliances and expand his power however much he wants on the diplomatic, on the foreign relations level. And then lastly, the king can't have too much wealth, right? Because again, wealth is power. So it's very clear that the Torah is going out of its way to limit the king's power. King cannot have too much power. Doesn't exactly say here why, even though it's kind of obvious to us, but it does keep emphasizing the king has limits. And those limits are further emphasized in the last three verses here. It says, when he's seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Right? What does the king have to have with him at all times? The king has to have his own Sefer Torah. Now, technically, we're all supposed to have a Sefer Torah, or at least we all have the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah at some point in our lives. But the king has a special obligation. We can go around without a Sefer Torah. We haven't yet fulfilled the mitzvah. That's okay. But a king has to have a Torah. And the king has to actually carry that Torah around with them at all times, right? Could you imagine if you had to carry a Torah around everywhere you go, even a little Torah, right? Like, again, that's kind of a burden, right? It's a very tangible physical burden. And we can imagine, what does it mean? The king has to carry that Torah around with him at all times. It continues here, let it remain with him, let him read it in all of his life, so that he may learn to revere his God, to observe faithful every word on this teaching, as well as these laws. King's got to carry the Torah, because there's one thing the king has to realize. It's his job to internalize the message of the Torah, to fear God. And most importantly, the last line, thus he will not act haughtily, arrogantly, toward his fellow Jews, or deviate from the instruction to the right or left, to the end that and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. Right? What's the concern? Why is the king has to have this Torah? Right? Same reason why the king has to have his power limited. Because the danger of a king is that a king is going to think they're a god, right? Or a king is actually going to be treated as a god, right? And that kind of imagining, right, can turn into the worst abuses of power imaginable. And if there's any message that the Torah is trying to get across to a king, is guess what, buddy? You're just kind of like everybody else. You're going to have limits. And more importantly, at the end of the day, you are accountable to God. Right? I remember once at my old shul, I gave a drasha where I noted that there's a Greek myth of the sword of Damocles. Right? If you're familiar with this, Damocles is a Greek king, right? And basically the way the story goes is that to be the king, you have to sit on the throne, but what hangs above the throne is a sword, right? That's basically held up by a tiny little thread. Right. So that anybody that sits in the throne on some level has to be worried that that sword could come crashing down on them. And it's both a tangible, again, and a symbolic reminder, right, that to be the king is to be vulnerable, right? It's a dangerous position to be in. People are kind of becoming gunning for you, coming for you, right? The Jewish message, the Torah's message about a Jewish king is a little bit different, right? It's not that you need to be fearful at all times for your power, but what you need to be constantly reminded of is you are going to be held accountable, right? There are rules that apply to you just like everybody else, right? You better use your power for good and you will be held accountable at the end of the day. Now, the key thing that I want to point out here yet again is, again, the concern is the abuse of too much power for the king, the abuse of power. That's very clear. But there is this line, right? This concern that with too many horses, the king is going to find himself back in Egypt again. Now, on a straightforward level, at the level of shot, right? The implication is that Egypt has the best horses in the Middle East. So if you want to get great horses, right, you're going to have to go back to Egypt. And again, we have to ask ourselves, right, of what purpose are horses for a king, right? As I said, it's a military usage. We already saw in the previous Torah section we were looking at what the primary use for horses are in the Middle East in the military sense, right? They're for chariots, right? And who has the best chariots in the Middle East, right? It's Egypt, right? So the concern is you're going to go back to Egypt to get horses, to have your chariots, right? To have your military strength. And what's clear is why is this so problematic, right? Of all of these things, right? Too many wives, too much wealth. Okay, we get that why that might be a problem, right? Too much money creates problems. Too many wives creates problems for you and for everybody else. But too much military power was the big deal, right? I happen to live in a country right now that happens to be located in the land of Israel, where there's a lot of people who think it's the greatest thing in the world to have as much military power as possible, right? Like we're the mightiest army in the Middle East, people like to claim, right? It's seen as something to boast about. So why would the Torah come and want to place limits then on the military power of the Jewish people in the land of Israel? So I want to just get at this a little bit by looking at the Abarbanel, and we'll keep at this. He says here in his commentary about kivana katuv shamelech lo yarbe lo susi me'artzo u'meyetar artzot, right? That the Torah comes to prohibit the king from having too many horses from his land or from other lands. V'lo yivtach al richvo kiravu, because the concern is we don't want the king, we don't want the Jews thinking that they can rely on their military might alone. V'al parshav, and his chariots, ki atzmo aval yeh miftacho b'Hashem yitbarach. Right? The concern is that the Jews in the land of Israel, they cannot rely just on themselves. That's a profoundly mistaken notion from the perspective of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, that the Jews can rely on themselves. Right? That's actually Moshe's greatest fear. This appears again and again in Devarim. Jews are going to go to the land of Israel, and they're going to think that they can just rely on themselves, and they're going to forget God, and more importantly, they're going to forget all the commandments, all the responsibilities, all the obligations that God has placed upon them. All right? That is the fear. And guess what? If they go back to Israel and they have too much military strength and they think they can rely on themselves, then in a sense, what they are effectively doing, as we're going to keep seeing, is that they are recreating Egypt. That is the fundamental fear here, right? Is that the Jews are going to think of themselves as self-sufficient in exactly the way the Egyptians did, exactly the way that Pharaoh did. Pharaoh saw himself as, again, the figure that unites heaven and earth. Pharaoh is the God king. Pharaoh is the one who enables everything about Egyptian society to essentially function properly, right? It is a world that when God reveals God's self to Pharaoh, Pharaoh cannot imagine the possibility of something that would exist outside of that. There was something that would be above that, right? And that is exactly the danger that awaits the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And we know this because in Sefer Shmuel, as I kept mentioning, it seems to really play up why a king is so problematic. The Jewish people approach the prophet Shmuel. We've already existed now as we jump ahead. There's been centuries of shoftim, of judges leading the Jewish people. But the Shoftim and the judges aren't the best leaders because they're kind of only chosen for a period of time, and then it's not clear who's going to rise up and take their place. And even when the judges rise up or are appointed by God, they're not in charge of everything, right? They're not like this. They're not CEO of the Jewish people. They're not the king of the Jewish people, right? They have a much more narrow, limited role. But by the end of Shmuel, of Shmuel's life, Shmuel himself is also a shofet and a navi, a prophet and a judge. The people are kind of fed up with this system, in part because they see that Shmuel's sons aren't so great, right? So they don't really know who the next leaders are going to be. Shmuel's been amazing, but his sons aren't so good. Like, what's going to come next? And they basically turn to Shmuel and they say, you know what? Like, your kids aren't going to be leading us, right? Like, we want a king. And that's what they tell him. They say, give us a king to judge us, just like all the other nations, right? Because Jewish existence without a king in the land of Israel is just something that they don't really want. They want to be like everybody else who's got a king to protect them, who's got a king to unite them. They don't want to be a bunch of tribes led by a group of leaders and really dependent on God. Now, how does Shmuel react when he hears this desire for a king? Well, we're told this thing displeased Shmuel, right? It made Shmuel very, very angry. And he immediately turns to God, basically out of the sense that, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, they shouldn't want a king, they shouldn't get a king. But what God says next is most critical. God turns to Shmuel and he says to him, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not be king over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day I brought them out of Egypt until today, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they do also to you. So we have to unpack these two verses. They're very, very, very important verses, if you ask me, and some of them the most important in the entire Tanakh, especially today. What God is telling Shmuel is that Shmuel, when they say they want a king, they're not rejecting you. Right? They're not saying, we don't like you, Shmuel, you weren't a good enough leader. We don't like your sons, they're not going to be good enough leaders. Ultimately, their desire for a king is a rejection of God. It is a rejection of God, because God is supposed to be their king. Right? And even more so, what God does is he connects the Jewish people's desire for a king as no different than all the other attempts the Jewish people have made to replace God with something else. Just as they tried to replace God with the golden calf at Mount Sinai, so too they're now trying to replace God with a king. Right? It's essentially an idolatrous desire, an idolatrous act. Because whenever you have a king, you're going to start looking at that king as a godlike figure, and inevitably, right, you're no longer going to have your faith, have your orientation, religious orientation be directed so much at God. Now, God tells Moshe this is a bad thing. This is a really bad thing, but God still lets them have a king. Right? He kind of seems to recognize that maybe, at least at this time, there's simply no other possibility, right? Just sort of as we say, why is it that God enabled the Jewish people or commanded the Jewish people to offer sacrifices, right? Rambam famously says, because at the time, the Jewish people couldn't imagine a relationship with God without sacrifices. So to a certain extent, you can make the same argument here, right? That at this point in time, at least, the Jews could not imagine a political way of life in the land of Israel without a king of some kind. Right. So even though it was a problem, and we know it's going to be a big problem, right? God still essentially let them have it, right? Because there was no other way. But the question is going to be, what do they do with it ultimately? Are they going to be able eventually to at least recognize and take responsibility for the fundamental problems that exist with the king? And of course, when Shmuel goes on, he goes on to basically tell the people, God says you can have a king, but I'm going to tell you what you get for having a king. Right? And God actually basically wants Shmuel to warn the people. If you appoint a king, this is what the consequences are ultimately going to be for you. And what he goes on to describe here is that the king is going to be this oppressive, domineering figure who oppresses the people, takes from them, and as we'll see, ultimately enslaves them. Right? So I'll read just a little bit of this. It says, Shmuel told all the words of the Lord to the Jewish people that had asked him of a king, and he said, this will be the manner of a king that will reign over you. He will take your sons, right? It's going to take people that you love and appoint them unto him and use them for himself, for his chariots, for his horsemen, and they shall run before his chariots. He'll appoint them for his captains of thousands and captains of fifties. Meaning he's going to draft your sons for the army, right? You have a king, he's going to want to take him to the army, age 18, maybe 3 years, maybe a lot longer than that, but they're going to be working for him no matter what. Not only is he going to take them for the arm, he's going to take them to plow the ground, to reap his harvest, right? He's going to be basically taking them to work for the king, right? To do the things the king wants. The king, it's not that they're going to work for the king and the king's going to give everything back to the people, right? They're going to work the king's land so the king can become wealthier, to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. He'll take not just your sons, he'll take your daughters to be his perfumers, cooks, to be bakers. He's going to take them to work for him, right? So that he can live this, great life by having them. Not only is he going to take your sons and daughters, he's going to take your fields, your vineyards, your olive yards, even the best of them. And he's going to give them not just for himself, but give them to the ones that are close to him, to the people that are close to him, right? Patronage. He's going to take what's yours unjustly, unfairly. He's going to take your land and he's going to give it to his own people, right? His own, court. Not only that, he's going to take 1/10 of your seed, of your vineyards, he's going to take from your produce. He's going to tax you and give to his officers and his servants. And he'll take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks. And then this is in verse Yud Zayin, verse 17. So in Chem Yaser, he's going to take 1/10. V'atem tiyu lo la'avadim, that you shall be for him as slaves. Right? And you cannot read those words, v'atem tiyu lo la'avadim, right, without thinking of Egypt, without thinking of Paro. And that's exactly the message that Shmuel is trying to tell the people. Yeah, you can have a king. You can have this person you're going to look up to as a godlike figure, as somebody who you think you need to be safe and secure in your land. But that king is ultimately going to oppress you. And you are going to find yourselves before you know it as his slaves. And you shall cry out on that day, right? Eventually you're going to suffer. You're going to realize how bad this decision was because of your king who you've chosen. But guess what? When you cry out at that time, the Lord will not answer you on that day, right? This is the big parent move, right? When your kid's going to do something you know is a bad idea, right? You try to lay out all the consequences, and then you tell them, you know what, though, if you go through with it, when that day comes and you have all these bad things that I tell you are going to happen, guess what? I ain't going to be there to help you out, right? Now, it's particularly striking here again as we think back to Egypt, right? It is exactly the moment when the Jewish people cry out in Egypt that what happens, right? God hears and God begins the process of liberation. But now what we're being told is the exact opposite. Again, it's purely a reference to Egypt. You will cry out, God will hear it, but God will not answer. But of course, the Jewish people hear this morning, and what do? They say, no, we're good. Just give us a king, that we may be like all the other nations, that our king may judge us and go up before us and fight our battles. They don't care. They want a king, regardless of what the consequences are going to be, regardless of the fact that having a king in the land of Israel runs the risk of that king becoming like Pharaoh and turning the land of Israel into Egypt, right? What is Egypt? How is Egypt described? It is the Beit Avadim, right? It's the house of slavery, of enslavement, of subjugation, of bondage. That is what you risk when you have a king, right? That is the fundamental danger, and that nobody can escape that. At least nobody who's not considered to be a favorite of the king, right? Who's close with the king, right? Who is somebody the king wants to look out for. If you're not part of that group, this is your future, right? Subjugation. This is the problem, I think, on many ways, as I keep saying, this is not like a subtle, complicated reading of the Torah. It's actually right on the surface of the Torah. It's just something that we often choose not to emphasize, in part because some of the political connotations of this today are kind of challenging for us. I mean, I'll just note this, right? The desire for a king in the land of Israel is not radically different from the desire of a state in the land of Israel, right? And the oppressive nature of any state, right, as we know, is always a real possibility, right? States, even the best states, right? People in America are experiencing this right now, right? You always run the risk that you can put in charge somebody who will become a tyrant, somebody who will take away freedom, and somebody who will oppress, right, people completely unfairly, right? That is always the risk. And the Torah is, again, deeply aware of this, because when we go on later in Sefer Malachim, right, we see all these kings rise up who are evil and oppressive. They subjugate, they steal, and even when the prophets come to tell them that what they're doing is awful, right, what does the king do? Right? The king just kills the prophets, right? They're going to be in power no matter what. Now, as I mentioned before, I keep referencing, Paro is the God king, right? The Jewish king is not supposed to be the God king, right? The Jewish king is supposed to be a human being, a Jew, right? Who is responsible to God and responsible to the Torah, right? In Egypt, though, in really the entire ancient Near East, right? The king is always a godlike figure. The king is always somewhere a god or close to the gods, right? The king is always a godlike figure. And why is the king always a godlike figure? Because the king is the one who has the power, right? And to have a power over others, right, over other human beings, right, for the king's word to be the law, for the king to say jump and we all say how high, right? That can't mean it's somebody normal. It can't just be somebody who's like the rest of us. It has to mean it's somebody who is somewhere beyond us in some fashion, right? And Chazal are deeply aware that Paro is very much the God king, right? In Sefer, I think it's Yechezkel, it's mentioned explicitly in Paro as if Paro is speaking. Paro says, "My river is my own, and I have made it for myself." Right? Paro is the God king. Paro is the one who claims to have created Egypt. Paro, as Yechezkel goes on to say, lives in the Nile. And Paro is actually called a tanin, like a crocodile in the Nile. Right? Paro is like, this is all mine. I've created all of this. Right? It is all mine. Right? And the message that Moshe, of course, brings to Paro is you're not a god. You're at all. Right? There's only one God who created heaven and earth. You are subject to him, and anything you think about you having power, you being a god, right, is purely a fantasy on your part, right? But that is the danger of Paro, and that is really the danger of every king. I mean, again, if you're familiar with stories of kings who have gone wrong, right, they go wrong and become corrupt in their power in a sense in which they start seeing themselves as being like almost godlike, godlike figures. And the concern for this, right, that again, the Jewish king will become like Paro, he will abuse his power, will enslave the Jewish people, right? It is all throughout Tanakh. And in many ways, the reason that the temple is destroyed is because the Jews can't have really, overcome this problem, right? This is not something that they are truly able to solve. They're aware of it. There are prophets that fight against it. There are a few good kings. But at the end of the day, what we see in the land of Israel by the end of the Tanakh is a society that is not a particularly good one, right? That is the danger. As one of my teachers once said, what makes the Jews unusual is that our most sacred book is a story of our failures. We put our failures all on display, right? Unlike, let's say, in America, when you learn American history when you're a kid, right, you just see all the good things, right? America, all the founding fathers, look at all the amazing things they did, and blah blah blah, right? Like everything's good, everything's great, right? But when you're a Jew and you read the Torah, like you cannot help but see the Jews' failures, particularly when it comes to a Jewish kingship in the land of Israel. As I said, though, it's not an easy thing for us to look at, especially when we have a Jewish state in the land of Israel, especially we have a Jewish state in the land of Israel that is often perceived as being under great threat and attack, right? So the concern that maybe power corrupts is not necessarily an easy lesson for us to take. When Jews were in exile, the notion that power corrupts was obvious to Jews. They just had to look at whatever goy, whatever non-Jew was in charge, right? When the Jews are in the land of Israel, that's a much more complicated message to potentially take in. What do I want to see? I'll just note that in Sefer Yeshayahu, the textual link about Egypt, about horses, right? It's already pretty explicit there, right? This concern of going back down to Egypt, going down to get the horses. I'll just read the verses quickly again to point out this is like it's the surface reading of a lot of what is going on here. This is the prophet speaking, and about the concern that the Jewish people in the land of Israel are going to still turn to Egypt for help, turn to Egypt because Egypt is powerful, try to get some of Egypt's power for their own. Here's what Yeshayahu says. It says, those who go down to Egypt for help and rely upon horses, right? That's why you go down there, to get the horses or rely upon Egypt's military might. They have put their trust in abundance of chariots, in the vast numbers of riders. They have not turned to the God of Israel. They have not sought God, right? It's very clear here. It's explicit. You want military power. You want the biggest power in the world, the superpower to be behind you. On some level, you are turning away from God. But the prophet continues, God too is wise, bringing on misfortune and not canceling prior pronouncements. God shall rise against the house of evildoers and the allies of the workers of iniquity. What prophet is, when Yeshua was saying is, I don't care if you go down to Egypt and they're behind you. I don't care if you got the mightiest army in the world. At the end of the day, God is going to still hold you accountable. And you got to know that, right? As he continues, for the Egyptians are human, not God, right? Paro might think of himself as the God king. Egypt might be the most powerful, empire in the Middle East. They're still not God. You might be the most powerful army, right? You're still not God. And their horses are flesh, not spirit. And when God stretches out a divine arm, the helper shall trip and the helped one shall fall, and both shall perish together. At the end of the day, again, you're going to be held accountable. You think you can escape it. You think you can rely on your own power. You think you can rely on Egypt's power. You think you yourself can be gods. That's simply not a possibility, right? The sense in which, again, what are the Jews enslaved to, if we want to put it that way? What is the danger of Egypt? The danger of Egypt is presuming that you can sanctify human power to the degree that you don't need to rely on God anymore. And if you try to sanctify power in that sense, you will ultimately find yourself enslaved to it. In fact, to sanctify it is the very act of enslaving yourself to it. Because the only thing that is not material power, right, on some level is the faith in God that we are supposed to carry within us. I want to just point to some of the modern political implications of this from the field of political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, probably the most important modern political philosopher, British, lives in the 17th century, very important British figure. He is what is called a monarchist after the British Civil War. British Civil War deposes the king, doesn't exactly institute full democracy or anything like that, but it's a big shift, right? We move away from kings, at least for a period of time. Ultimately, the monarchy gets reestablished, but that moment of revolution in England is a very important one in setting forth the possibility that, again, human beings can be free, that human beings can, have their opinions be heard and they can matter politically. They don't have to just be subjugated to a king. The echoes of this, the ripples of this, of the revolution are very important for the American Revolution and French Revolution, which come in the following centuries. But in the reestablishment of monarchy, which follows again civil war and internal violence in England, Thomas Hobbes writes a book called Leviathan. And it's the most important book of political philosophy in the modern period, probably because it establishes the basic foundation for how states function. That to be a state, right, you have to have sovereign authority, sovereign power, right? A state has to have on some level total power over its inhabitants. And not only does the state have total power over its inhabitants, the inhabitants give power to the state, such that it should have total power. Why? Because unless the state has that power, it can't keep people safe. Right? Thomas Hobbes' basic conclusion is that we live in a world when we don't have sovereignty, we don't have kings or states, right? An anarchic world in which life is brutal, nasty, and short, he says. It's not easy. A state, a sovereign, right, helps us overcome that problem. We can actually maybe go to bed at night and not be worried somebody's going to kill us because there's an army, there's a police, there's force, right? There's security. That's at least the hope. Now, the way it works for Hobbes is that the state is ultimately embodied in this figure called the sovereign, right? Essentially is the king. Doesn't have to be a king, but it's primarily the way that Hobbes conceives of it. The king is the embodiment of the state. The king represents the state, right? The king unites all the people together into a state. And on the cover of Leviathan, I'll just note, why is this book called Leviathan, right? Because Leviathan is this biblical figure of profound power, right? And that's what the king, the sovereign, has to be. It has to be like a Leviathan. It has to be able to crush, smother, overcome any obstacle. Now, this is from the front part of Hobbes' Leviathan. The picture is supposed to be the picture of the king, right? The sovereign. And if you look closely, you'll see there's all these like little people inside of him. Because the idea is that the sovereign is the sort of unification of all the people. Just as we imagine today, the state is like the unity of all the people. But the sovereign, the state, the king has to have both the military power, right? That's what the sword represents, the monopoly on violence. But on the other hand, is actually a symbol of ecclesiastical authority, right? For Hobbes, the religious and political have to be united in the king, right? The king has to control both. Because if the religion isn't basically under the king, then the religion serves as an alternative source of power to the king. Religion can then be a source of authority that rebels against the king, right? So everything has to be under the king's power, and the king essentially has to have total power. The state has to have total power to preserve the safety and security of its citizens. Now we have to unpack again, this Leviathan figure becomes the sovereign picture of the sovereign becomes one of the most important concepts in modern political philosophy, right? When we look at Hobbes, Hobbes says something very interesting about the sovereign. So Hobbes is technically a Christian, but he's kind of a strange kind of Christian in a certain sense. Part of what makes also his work, Leviathan, so important is that he actually tries to work his political philosophy through a reading of Tanakh. He's actually he has a lot of very interesting creative readings of Tanakh as trying to understand it from a political perspective. We're not going to look at that right now, but in one of the most important chapters of Leviathan, the chapter in which he imagines the sovereign and the central role of the sovereign, keeping the peace, right? He says the only way to erect such a common power as he may be able to defend them from invasion or foreigners and the injuries of one another. That's the king's job. Protect from enemies without and within, right? As that's the role. Is to confer all their power and strength upon one man. People have to unite together and say, okay, this person's in charge, or upon one assembly. Hobbes allows for a certain amount of potentially the Republican democracy of men that may reduce all their wills, plurality of voices unto one will. Now, you create this figure of the sovereign who's going to have all this power. Hobbes notes something very interesting. He says, this is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather to speak more reverently. So what is Leviathan? What is the sovereign? What is the state? The mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. So what Hobbes is noting here is that the king is second to God, right? And the king is what he literally calls a mortal God, right? The sovereign is a mortal God. Well, we have a word for in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism, for what a mortal God is, right? It's an idol, right? The problem that here's not even a problem for Hobbes. Hobbes is saying this is like necessary. Is that when you create a state, once you create an authority, once you create a sovereign, you are going to treat them as a godlike figure because you are giving them all the power, right? And Hobbes sees that as a good thing. The Torah would see that as a fundamentally terrible thing. And one of the very interesting things I've seen that certain scholars argue, and I've actually done more work, I think, trying to prove this point, is that when Hobbes imagines the sovereign as a god king, he actually has a particular biblical figure in mind. You want to take a guess who that biblical figure in mind is that Hobbes is thinking about when he creates the sovereign, the god king? It's Paro. Now, why is that? Well, in part because the sovereign is supposed to be represented by Leviathan, right? Leviathan. And guess what? When you look at Tanakh, right, Paro, as I already said, is referred to as a tanin, as an alligator, right, that's living in the Nile. He's also understood to be like Leviathan, right? And that when Hobbes imagines this figure of total power, to a large extent, he is imagining Paro. That his vision of the state means a Paro in charge in one form or another. Now, from the Jewish perspective, right, there's something profoundly twisted about that, right? Because what we're essentially saying is that every state on a certain level recreates the dynamics of Egypt, dynamics that almost inherently lead or inevitably lead to oppression and suffering, subjugation, and slavery, and the trampling of all individual freedom, individual rights, and the simple fact that all human beings are created in the image of God. Now, one of the things that Hobbes goes out of his way to argue throughout the book is there cannot be limits on the sovereign's authority. It is the exact opposite of the Torah. If the Torah, when it introduces a king, keeps trying to say you got to limit his power here, limit his power here, limit his power here, don't make sure he's not too arrogant, carry our Torah around at all times, Hobbes is the exact opposite. King has to have unlimited power, or the king can't do what's necessary, because the crisis will come and the king won't be able to act. Right, so the king has to have, the sovereign has to have all the power that it needs. State has to have all the power that it needs. Otherwise, it won't be able to protect us. There cannot be limits on the sovereign's power. Now, this is again, from the Torah perspective, hugely problematic. Right, there has to be limits on the sovereign's power, and people have a right to speak up against the abuses of power of the king, of the sovereign. Right, that's the prophet's job. God is going to speak out against the king, against the sovereign. Now, as I mentioned before, all states reproduce this. That's why even democratic states can slide back into tyranny, slide back into subjugation, even without necessarily people realizing it. And when I was originally doing some of the research on this, it was during the time of the legal reform here in Israel, the attempted legal reform by the current government, which essentially was going to enable the Knesset to be the total source of power, right? Instead of the Bagatz, the Israeli Supreme Court, having the ability to disqualify certain Israeli laws for violating certain moral and legal principles, right? Instead, the legal reform is intended to put as much power into the Knesset as possible, right? The idea being the Knesset is the sovereign, they're elected by the people, judges are elected by the people, right? The people have the power, the people are sovereign. Remember that picture of Leviathan, the king is made up of all the people, right? Who's the entity in Israel that's made up of all the people, right? It's the Knesset, it's not the judges, right? Who are they? They're not elected, right? So the Knesset has to have the power. They have to be sovereign. There cannot be limits on their authority, right? That is essentially what the legal reform is about at its core, which again, I would argue is a deeply un-Jewish way of thinking, really goes against the spirit of the Torah in every possible way. And what was interesting is during the protest, this is one of the protests a couple of years ago, right? They've unfolded this image of Bibi as Paro, right? Let my people go. And what was fascinating, right, is when they did this, the Anti-Defamation League in America actually issued a statement saying that this was anti-Semitic. It was anti-Semitic to associate Bibi with Paro, right? Right, to use that kind of imagery in that way. And all I remember thinking about that at the time was how, like, again, I don't look to the ADL for religious guidance, but what they are expressing is ultimately, again, fundamentally counter to what the Torah is all about. Is the Torah worried that this is going to happen? Absolutely, right? It's the whole thrust of what we've been looking at right now. You're going to leave Egypt. You're going to go to Israel, but you are going to, again, appoint a king, create a state that will ultimately become a pharaoh, and you are going to potentially turn Jewish life in Israel into like that of Egypt. Right? That is the fear of the Torah in a very straightforward sense. I want to conclude just by reading again Rabbi Tamarit, who we've looked at before. He's been sort of a steady voice throughout these sessions, who also just recognizes this very, very clearly, that the concern of a king is the concern of appointing a pharaoh. And again, what he also recognizes, and I've talked about this before, is how is it that Pharaoh could rule Egypt, right? How did people not see that what he was doing, that he wasn't a god, and that he was abusing his power, that he was oppressing people, right? How did they not get that? And Tamaritz's point is that we've seen this before, right? You can create a society to such an extent that that which is bad can be seen as good, and that which is good can be seen as bad, right? We can create societies that way. We do it all the time, right? It's such that people they misrecognize what is going on. They cannot see oppression for what it is, and they cannot see righteousness for what it is, right? That was the kind of place that Egypt was. And that is always the danger that the Torah presents to us, for Jews as well. I'll just read in the middle here. It says, Pharaoh became God, and so had absolute justification to trample men mercilessly. For who, after all, can challenge God? Therefore, when the Blessed Holy One wanted to guard the Torah against impostors, greedily seizing it to justify and excuse their persecuting, injuring, and inflicting indignities upon other men. Meaning part of the concern that Tamaris is saying is Jews are going to take the Torah, and instead of the Torah being a warning, instead of the Torah being a limit, they're going to use the Torah as a tool to oppress others. They're going to reinterpret the Torah as a means to tell people that they're actually the ones who are wrong and essentially need to embrace their own subjection, their own slavery. That's the danger, right? He chose to introduce it with his own severe retributions upon Egypt. All of this is alluded to in the first of the Ten Commandments uttered by the Blessed One, holy would be he, at Mount Sinai. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, not out of Egypt of simple natural killers. Egypt wasn't a bad place because it had lots of people who were just like psychopaths, right? Like who were just crazy. That's not why Egypt was bad. Rather, out of Egypt of lying impostors who convinced themselves they had the right to enslave the children of Israel. Right? What made Egypt so terrible is, as I told you, people used the law to convince themselves that the subjection of the Jewish people was actually right, was actually justified. And then he concludes, he says, the entire section of Deuteronomy, the laws of the king, limiting the king's power, comes to present an exalted conception of the Israelite monarchy, forbidding trust in the accumulation of silver, gold, and prancing steeds, lest the people be turned again to the paths of Egyptians, to the ways of the Egyptian tyrants. Right, that's the concern. You're not going to go back to Egypt, but you will recreate Egypt. Right, that is the fundamental. That is always the fundamental danger. And it's something, as I said, it's true in every state. Right, if you believe the Exodus is about God rejecting slavery, rejecting tyranny, recognizing the necessity of human freedom, and then the question becomes, how do we build a society that is free? Well, on some level, you have to be then aware that any authority, any state that you create runs the risk of devolving into Egypt. And it runs that risk without you even necessarily realizing it, right? The Jewish people are told what's even worse. Jewish people are told what's going to happen to them. You want a king? He's going to oppress you. He's going to abuse you. He's going to take your sons. He's going to take your daughters. Your life is going to be awful. You're never going to know peace. And what do the Jews say? We want it anyway, right? It's not clear. Do they think it won't really happen? Do they think, maybe it will be bad, but it won't be as bad as he says, or maybe it'll be bad, but you know what? We already saw this, right? What happened when they faced the Red Sea and Paro's army behind them, right? They said to Moshe, it would have been better if you never took us out of Egypt. Part of me, again, when they want a king, when life in Israel gets hard, essentially what they're saying is, you know what? We kind of want to go back to Egypt. It was a little better there. So if we can't go back to Egypt, at least we can We can be like all the other nations. We can make our Egypt here. And if it means being slaves, you know what? It's better than the challenges of freedom. And that is, again, one of the biggest threats is always that backsliding, that going back to Egypt. And what the Torah is trying to tell us is no matter what, you can't go back. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to open up for some questions.
I was just going to say the parallels to today are pretty unsettling to see in America and in Israel.
Right. I'll note in America, I didn't bring this. The American Revolution, the founding fathers often understood the British, King George, through this narrative of the story, right? Benjamin Franklin famously suggests that the first symbol of America should be there's pictures of this, of the Jews crossing through the Red Sea, right? So the concern, in a certain sense, what is America, this is a larger conversation, but America's political imagination is much more structured through the narratives of the Torah than the state of Israel. And that's the advantage, meaning America has these great checks and balances in large part because it internalized the Torah's message, something that Israel does not have. And number two, in America, there's this profound sense of the potential backsliding, right? The famous line of Thomas Jefferson, I can't remember, right? They come out of the Constitutional Convention, right? They ask the founding Jefferson, do we have a republic? Right. And Jefferson famously says, if you can keep it. Right. America has this sense of the backsliding, which means there's a real thinking about what are we doing? How do we approach this? In Israel, there's less, even though we're supposed to be the people of the book, right? There's in some sense, a little less of this kind of thinking. Ben Gurion, this is for another conversation, right? He really was concerned that there can't be limits on state power, right? His whole concept of mamlachtiyut, right? That's what he called it, like melech. Right, is that the state has to really have all this power, only way for the Jews to survive. But as, again, the Torah makes clear, right, there are profound risks and dangers that result in that. But next week, we'll look at freedom and what does it really mean to be free and keep it.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you so much to everyone else who joined us today. Next week, we have the final class for this session, so I hope to see you there. Also, a reminder that we have other classes happening right now. You can find information and sign up at dresha.org/classes. And lehitraot for now.